So this guy, he goes by the name of Han. He grew up in rural China, the son of farmers and the grandson of farmers. And like millions of other Chinese youth, he was a model citizen. He memorized communist edicts as a child, he never skipped classes, and he even got into a decent university. And when he moved into his dorm rooms, he hung up a picture of Mao above his bed. So just as long as he continued to follow the script, he was destined to become a civil servant or a white-collar worker. But then something changed. Enter Fan Bingxing, otherwise known as the father of China's Great Firewall. I'm going to refer to him as FBX. Now, FBX is famous and reviled for one thing, which is designing the whole architecture of internet censorship in China. But he's very proud of what he's done, so he gives lots of public talks about the dangers of the internet and the need to control it. So it was at one of these very public talks that Han ended up throwing his shoes at FBX and thus joining the global ranks of other people who have used shoe throwing as a form of protest. So for those of you who are familiar with the story, I have a sense of what you're probably thinking, which is, right, this is crazy. China is one of the last countries you want to end up on the government's radar for publicly embarrassing a high-level official. So this kid, he's probably going to end up in a labor camp, rot his 20s away in jail, or he's just going to disappear. So what happened to him? Nothing. I was just hanging out with him a couple weeks ago, and he's looking for a job. So if anyone wants to hire a brave, independent thinker in China, he is your man. So I met with Han because I wanted to find out, how does the son of a farmer end up making international news for throwing shoes at the man behind the largest internet censorship system in the world and then live to tell the tale? So I've spent the last few years studying how people create and manage trust, especially in conditions where trust seems difficult to foster. And I'm learning that while trust is critical to almost everything we do, it's one of those things that's just kind of difficult to predict when it's going to happen, because it just can kind of pop up and then erode at a moment's notice. And we can see this through Han's story. So when Han moved to the city to go to college, he saw several things that made him question his beliefs in social equality. I mean, all the institutions in his life, from his family to his school to his university, they emphasized the rewards of hard work. But to him, it seemed like the hardest working people in society sometimes remained the most poor. Well, so separately, about a year into college, one of his friends said, "Hey, there's this website I know. You should sign up for it, and we can learn more about our major." So this website is called Twitter, and Han created an account. And on Twitter, Han found regular, everyday people who talked freely about things that they were interested in, from memes to politics. But Twitter, like many other sites in China, has been blocked since 2009. So the only way to get on is through the use of a VPN, a virtual private network. But a VPN it's a pain, and it makes things really slow. So the 2%, or the estimated 2%, of China's 510 million internet users who do use a VPN kind of feel special and proud because it's a small community. And even FBX himself has publicly bragged about the 6 VPNs he uses to test out the very firewall that he created. But luckily for Han, he didn't have to figure this out by himself because his Twitter community was there to help him. So on Twitter, he found people who shared similar interests with him. And then eventually, this shared interest turned into a sense of a shared identity, as the community bonded in knowing that they were all crossing the firewall for this common reason, to get to forbidden information. And Han told me that once he felt connected to this web of like-minded people, he felt a sense of shared responsibility to tweet good information that couldn't be found within China's internet. So as it is for many of us, constantly checking Twitter soon became this daily ritual for Han. And so it was on Friday May 19th, 2011, as Han was getting out of lecture, he pulled out his cell phone out of his pocket to check his Twitter stream, only to find messages that FBX, the father of China's Great Firewall, was speaking at a university in the same city that he was living in. So all these tweets, were from people telling people to come out and give FBX a hard time. So Han had to see this. He wanted to witness what people were going to do to him and then report back to his followers on Twitter. So Han showed up at the lecture hall that FBX was scheduled to speak at. But he bumped into two students who were holding several eggs in their hands that they were planning to throw at FBX. But things didn't go as planned because they got nervous. As the students saw FBX on approach, they also saw their professors were walking next to him. So they panicked. So they took the eggs and they shoved them in Han's hands. So as FBX was walking past him, Han, without hesitation, with the eggs already in his hands, he turns around and he throws them at FBX, but he missed. So in this act of final desperation, he takes off his shoes and then turns around and throws them at FBX's chest, and he hit. So we don't have a picture of that moment, but this is how it was portrayed on the internet. So Han knew that he had to get out of there quickly, so he bolted out of the lecture hall, and with security guards and teachers chasing after him. And when he finally thought he had outran them, he stopped for a moment to give his feet a rest from the hot pavement, and he sent out a few tweets, including messages like this, like "Security guards have arrived, more than 10 people are chasing me." So then he starts running again, finally gets off campus, and he sends more updates to Twitter, including some pictures of his shoeless, blistered feet. So by the time he got back to his dorm room, he just saw these deluge of tweets of people cheering him on for his heroic act, many of which were accompanied by two hashtags, fuck FBX and fuck GFW. GFW stands for Great Firewall. So by now, this had become major international news. So he was getting tweets of supporting him from all around the world for his really brave and risky act. And he was getting also offers of lots of gifts from around the world, including sexy girls, Apple products, VPNs, a vacation to Thailand, a one-night stand, a bag of American pistachio nuts, and of course, a new pair of shoes. So while this whole story may seem to be about one person's bravery, at no point was Han ever acting alone. Because by the time he arrived at the university, he was part of this loose collective of people sharing information that exposed new ideas, and ideas that eventually led to new behaviors. And so while hundreds of people were forwarding on information about FBX's talk and to harass him, the whole event was accomplished with no formal commands, no organizational charts, and no personally known sources. So considering that this kid is just, from this ordinary village, it's pretty amazing that he became this international symbol for information freedom, while FBX became the butt of many internet censorship jokes. So to understand how, we got here, how Han got here, we have to understand a bit about how trust is constructed in the context of China. So there's people like you, me, and Han, and then there's these self-organized collectives like Wikipedia or Anonymous or these self-emergent events that happen on Twitter. Now, there's a lot of interest lately in how these self-organized collectives come to be, especially in light of recent events like Occupy, London riots, and Arab Spring. But I'm really interested in how do individuals make decisions that end up syncing up with these self-organized collectives? I want to know, what are all the things people do before they get into a collective and then identify with it? It all has something to do with how we build up the trust to acquire information and then to share it with sources we don't personally know. So I'm a cultural sociologist, and I use really immersive ethnographic methods to understand how people use technology in their daily lives. So this means I get to have a lot of fun. So some examples of what I get to do is I spend a lot of time shopping with students for cell phones, and they hang out at a KFC afterwards trying to figure out how to use a phone and share pictures with their friends. Or I live with migrants working as a street vendor selling dumplings to construction workers, all to observe how these secondary cell phone markets pop up around these construction sites and watch how construction workers kind of fetishize smartphones or play with them, even if they can't afford them. Or oftentimes, you'll find me gaming and sleeping inside internet cafes, or sleeping alongside with everyone else who's spending the night there. So I do all this to hear stories like Han's, because I think they tell us a lot about how trust operates online, and how we socialize. So let's talk about this by going back to the big question that's still out there, which is, why wasn't Han arrested? Well, the police did visit him several times. They even took him out to tea, which in China means they take you out to dinner and then they get you really drunk in order to intimidate and interrogate. But before the police actually did this, they put all this indirect pressure on the institutions that he was a part of. Now, we're all embedded in institutions the minute we're born, whether it's in sexuality, gender, nationality, ethnicity, or markets. But how this looks varies around the world. And in China, it isn't only the individual who is responsible for her or his actions, it's also the institution to which they belong to. So in China, what happens is that all these institutions keep these really personal, detailed records that most people will never see. And supposedly, it includes information on everything from your school grades to teachers' reviews on your moral behavior and your personality flaws, any kind of unpatriotic acts that you've committed, or any involvement with the law. And all of this information is kept in a sealed brown envelope that follows you in life as you move from institution to institution. So since Han is a student, the university is responsible for his personal records. So when the police needed to put pressure on Han, they didn't go to him directly. They went first to his university, because the police trusted that the university would be able to reprimand and fix Han, because institutions trust other institutions to get things done. Furthermore, the police assumed that Han would be corrected by the university because, like most bureaucracies, institutions only see people as existing within other institutions. Now, the police eventually did go to Han. They wanted information. They wanted to know, who was he collaborating with? What was this rebel group he was part of? But who was Han going to name? All the hundreds of people forwarding on calls about FBX's lecture, or all the hundreds of people sending gifts from around the world? The point is that the police just didn't get it. There was no central command for them to go after. Institutions are really slow to recognize emergent systems with radically different trust mechanisms, command and power structures, and protocols. And well, this became really obvious when FBX demanded to know from the organizers, why didn't anyone tell him what people were conspiring to do against him on Twitter? To which they replied, Twitter is across the firewall that you built. Right. So, well, this is still pretty serious because the police and university are still after Han, right? But Han told me he wasn't scared of them. And when I asked him why, he said, well, I'm just disillusioned with them. So when people lose trust in institutions, top-down corrective measures don't work so well. Now, if we actually stop just to think about it for a moment, it's still pretty amazing that this whole shoe-throwing feat was pulled off in the first place, especially considering that Han only intended to go as a witness. Well, it all worked because the loose and unnamed collective that Han was a part of acted like a proper self-healing meshwork, where if one node became weak, another node could pop up. So even though the students with the eggs became too scared to carry out the plan, Han took on the group responsibility of carrying it out, because Han is a closer. I mean, he was just as equally committed to carrying out the act of dissent, even though he wasn't conscious of it up until the last second. The strength of any collectives are that decisions are binding on all the members. Because, things don't always go as planned. But that's the beauty of self-organized collectives, is that they build trust in ways that are really adaptive and flexible. And, well, this is a challenge for these top-down institutions. But even top-down institutions can produce very unintended consequences. Well, news of the shoe-throwing event spread really quickly online and internationally. It was actually contained very quickly nationally within China because information around the event was quickly censored. So, for example, Sina Weibo, China's largest microblog, FBX's name, ironically, was blocked from search. So since censorship prevented this from becoming major national news within China, the local police probably didn't get a lot of pressure to do anything more serious to Han, which meant that Han remained safe. So, even though no one wants to live behind a giant firewall, sometimes firewalls can protect people in the absence of a consistent rule of law or without very consistent access to information rights. Information can only be free to the extent that people aren't in danger for accessing it or sharing it. But what I find really fascinating is that even when there is a danger and a risk, people still find ways around it by getting their hands on it from people they don't personally know. So we can think about how this is accomplished in terms of social circles and social networks. So social circles consist of people you already know, like friends, family, and acquaintances. And social networks consist of people we don't, or entities that we don't have a personal relationship with. So it can be like an individual stranger, an institution, it could be a website or a search engine. So social circles reinforce our relationships, while social networks expand them. So when trust comes into play, social circles build on existing relations of trust, while social networks build out new relations of trust. And this distinction, while it may seem minor, actually makes a really big difference for how we acquire and share information. Now, the underlying idea in the social graph is that the more we do all the sharing stuff, the more data can be collected about our relationships. And this is supposed to be a good thing, because then it reveals things like common interests, predictive behaviors, and identified influencers. But the mathematical logic behind efforts to map the social graph relies on discrete definitions of people's relationships. And this is problematic because it implies that the social graph is a web of trust, with the connection strength between ties as an indicator of the measurement of trust. But sharing doesn't always mean we trust a connection or a network. Sometimes sharing means that we're trying to figure out trust. And we figure out trust not just as an individual embedded in webs of relationships, but as an individual embedded in webs of institutions. But it's actually really hard to algorithmically represent the strength of individual or institutional affiliations, much less how these affiliations change over time, because it's all dependent on this fragile thing called trust that unfolds within the unpredictable contingencies of everyday life. And we can see how Han's affiliation to a Twitter community strengthened the more and more he lost trust in the institutions that he used to believe in. So individuals have to move in between multiple contexts, some thicker, some thinner, and some stickier and some looser. But sometimes those movements challenge the internal consistency of an institution. And when they do, power that was once considered a given becomes a question. And sometimes that can start with a simple whisper, a forward, or an at, or in Han's case, a tweet. So the things that we do every day with information may seem really simple, like a +1, a post to a wall, or a hashtag. But these information acts are actually incredibly complex. They reveal extraordinary ideas about what we expect the information we share and acquire to do for others and for ourselves. And we do these things to test out reactions, to communicate, to see if others notice what we share, and if others think it's important enough to be shared with other people. But we have to feel safe in order to share, not just with people we know, but also with people we don't know. And this actually becomes really important, the whole sharing with people we don't know part, because social change, much less any kind of collective activity, it can't happen unless we reach out of our social circles and into our social networks. And this is precisely what anyone is trying to figure out who's trying to create a social app or social service, because we want to raise people's trustworthiness so that they can move out of their circles and into other networks to increase participation or engagement. But there are no clearly marked paths for essentially talking to strangers or unknown entities, such as the algorithms that structure our interaction. These paths have to be personalized and paved and tested over time. In the same way that we see pedestrians creating desire paths to take them from where they are to where they want to be in the most efficient manner, we also see users creating desire paths of trust online. We perform information acts, such as favoriting and checking in, that serve as a set of trust-exploring practices to determine the least risky path to connect with someone we don't personally know. So desire paths decrease social distance. But it's actually really hard to predict when these paths are going to show up, because like Han, we start out on many paths, but we aren't always sure which one we're going to take until we're in the moment. So while no one else is throwing shoes at government officials in China, Han actually isn't alone. that millions of people in China are forwarding, acquiring, and sharing information with people they don't personally know, it signals to a massive and collective shift in people's trust moving from social circles to social networks. And this new shift means new needs and new opportunities to be filled. But this is a two-way exchange in trust, because the more information you get from people you don't know, you have to give up some information. And once you make information more visible, it means that people can find it and connect with it more easily. But with visibility comes traceability, and information doesn't pick sides. So when I last met with Han, he told me that he felt like he was living in this world of zombies, who are eating him up, like one piece at a time, almost slowly and unnoticeably. And he was telling me that he's scared that he's soon just going to give up and be like everybody else. But in the meantime, he can't help but have all these questions about the world now that he knows that there's all this information out there. The problem is that he just doesn't know what to do with them in the meantime. But like the Chinese say, dancing with handcuffs is better than not dancing at all. Thank you.
Thanks, Tricia. That was great. Excellent.
This is if you were here for the first day, you'll understand Pierre's talk.
Yesterday, there was we explored data visualization. I mean, you showed the social graph, kind of a basic one. Are you using, or any of your students using, kind of advanced visualizations to watch tweet traffic around the research you're doing?
Well, we actually take advantage of the data visualization apps that people provide through Facebook and through through third-party services. But mainly, but the thing is that these social graphs, they can tell us a lot about a snapshot in time of people's relationships, but you still have to end up talking to people to find out what's behind the meaning behind these connections. So they only can tell us so much.
You've also done work outside of China, in Latin America, we think, right?
And Mexico,
And Mexico, right. What do you see differences in trust? I mean, I think that's a really huge question.
Oh my God.
Institutions are different, policies are different, but
yes.
Are there some things that you found really marking differences?
Well, the remarkable difference is that because the migration policy patterns are different in Mexico and China, when people migrate in Mexico to the US, they're essentially illegal citizens in the US. So it's a very tricky environment of who you build trust with to get you across the border, because your life is actually on the line, and once you're in the States, you don't have a legal identity. And so you're still on the line of being sent back, which means then your whole family doesn't have food or it can't survive. But in China, people give the Chinese government, I think, a really hard time about, all these migrants in the city they're not making enough money, they can barely survive, but they're not illegal citizens in their own country. And if something were to happen, they always have land to return back to, at least in most places. As question was, yeah, they have a place, and they're not illegal. Yeah. So this creates a whole different kind of trust environment, radically different.
Our final question. You're also a teacher. You're not just a researcher. You also teach. Your students, have their responses to some of this surprised you or shocked you? What have you learned from your students as you go through this with them?
Well, right now I'm currently, I'm teaching my research assistants in China, so those are the students I interact with most closely. And what I find fascinating is that I'm learning a lot from them, because we have this perception that Chinese students don't know how to do teamwork, or just Chinese, China in general, right? And they're very individualistic. But what I have found is this whole fascinating world that is not visible to us unless you talk to them, which is called cheating. And cheating to us is like this bad thing that bad students do. But for them, it's like the most talented students know how to do collaborative cheating. And it's because their teachers aren't teaching great classes. So because they care about doing the other stuff that they care about that the teachers or schools don't care about, they find ways of collaborating on tests. And so they're learning the skills for online group collaboration through cheating efforts. And that's why you get really amazing collaborative efforts like Human Flesh Search Engine, or these translation team groups that translate videos, or TV shows from the US within 8 hours. It's all through these collaborative efforts. So there's so much collaborative effort going on in China. It's just you have to kind of dig underneath.
And that's all going on within an official institution of education.
Yeah.
That's preparing them for the counterculture in a way.
Yes.
Okay, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Tricia Wang,
you.
everybody.